Diese Konferenz wird nun aufgezeichnet.
Yeah, today's topic. Last week we were talking a little bit about importing, exporting data. I think most of you will have some experience with creating your own applications, typical fat client applications, and nowadays there are a lot of possibilities to create applications using the web application instead of a fat client applications. From my perspective, both worlds still will have the reliability to remain in the market, because web applications are for some reasons really good, really easy, but nobody will have a fully functional ERP accounting system on his mobile device on a 5-inch screen. It does not make sense, and that's one of the reasons why we typically have always the situation that we have a mixture of applications. Most of our customers are working with a application which is more or less a fat client application, a back office system or something like that. And a lot of them simply need some very small, very easy way to display, for example, working time bookings on mobile devices, or simply a status of an order, or whatever you need. And having this kind of devices as fat client applications, and fat client applications often means also the way like a binary application which is created on Apple iPhone or on Android devices, really have some big disadvantages, especially regarding the distribution of such a piece of software. We have some customers and some friends, for example, who are creating a piece of software for pilots, for private pilots, for navigation purposes. And whenever they distribute a new version on Windows or on Android, it's really an easy task, but it takes at least between 5 and 2 weeks, 5 days and 2 weeks, until a bug fix version is, for example, in the App Store market from Apple. And that's really one of the things that could be really annoying if you have, for example, a really bad version of your software uploaded and you are aware of that only after people were working with that already. It might be not a good idea to wait for 2 weeks until you have a bug fix uploaded. It could be that your customers will already get angry about that. And one of the reasons why I really like these technologies is we can, for example, use almost anything that you can imagine on a mobile device directly from a web browser today. There are HTML5 applications, and HTML5 applications have APIs, for example, also to get information from GPS sensor or from camera and so on. But I know from a lot of typical customers from the IBExpert world that they are very often experienced programmers, but they are very often also not the experienced mobile device programmers and not HTML programmers, because they often have the problem, okay, I know the VCL from Delphi, I know how to access data, I know how to display data in my application, but how to get the data from your database, for example, not on a fat client application, get it on a mobile device. And I will show you some of the possibilities, how easy it is to do such a job, also with the right tools. Let's have a look at what I'm talking about. We have some files here downloaded, which are currently not really so important, but I want to show you one internet address where you can download all examples that I will show you. IBExpert.com/get-together. I think we should only use one dash for that. And we have here, for example, a zip file, a 7-zip file. And the 7-zip file has all the content and is a pre-configured Apache server inside, and almost everything that you need for understanding what we are talking about in a few minutes. Because I do not want to waste your time with explaining you every single configuration parameter. We just want to have a simple and small start for the application that we want to show you. And you can download the zip file. It's a free zip file. It contains a Apache, it contains a PHP environment and some source code examples. And everything that you have in that file is, for example, here in that file also. And I will unpack that to this directory. And you will see, for example, what is inside that file. And I always recommend, for example, to take the IBE web folder as it is created from inside the zip file. I cut it and I place it directly here in the main folder of your drive C. That's some of the files are pre-configured based on that folder structure, and it always makes sense to have this folder structure already working, because in that case you do not have to think about making an Apache work together with a Firebird server. And we have also here some really very basic and not ready to publish training document, but you will see when you have a look at the training document, you will have some informations about what is included, some screenshots and so on. And we are working on that to make it a little bit more complete in the future. We also have a Apache server 2.4 for Windows inside that archive. And we also have, for example, a predefined PHP in that archive. So in almost all Windows versions, you can directly start working with that application and with that framework. And you do not have to install anything by hand. You can directly start that. And we also have a Firebird server inside that project because we want to make it as easy as possible for you to work with that combination on a test environment. Let's have a look at what we are doing when we are starting the first demo application. We simply say for this batch file, edit, and we see here, for example, we do some starting process, looking for this process. We go to the Apache bin directory. We start a HTTPS VB script, it's more or less just starting the executable. We're doing a timeout. We are doing some file copies to a specific directory. And then we start the local Apache web server using the port 8080. And it should show us in the subdirectory demo1 the index.html, and afterwards it should simply stop. So what happens if I press that button, that batch file? I start the batch file, and we see here a very basic example how to get data from your Firebird server. And when you see here, when I click on that button, you see here directly a timestamp. The timestamp is directly taken from the Firebird server. One of the main reasons I want to show you that is it does not make sense if I will show you a fully functional 1000 lines of code example that it is already working with the correct application settings and everything else. Because in most cases, you will not even find a clue in that moment when you need the real parts that needed to be activated. If you go to the task manager and have a look at what the processes are that are currently executed, Brave is the browser that I'm using here. We have a myfirebird.exe. The myfirebird.exe is a Firebird server that is directly used inside that examples. and a my-http.exe. These are two executables which are started by the batch file, because we do not want to have an overwritten installation on your local machine already. If you have already used Apache, if you have already a Firebird server locally installed, it should not be overwritten without any excuse on that machine, because it makes no good sense to do so. So let's have a look what happens here technically inside. Technically, it's a very simple application. When we go to the source code, we simply see here that we have a doc type, and we have here something which is called rtl.run. And in the next step, we will later see what happens technically inside. I will show it to you, like what is the source code here inside, implemented. But first, have a look at what the physical implementation is that you need for making an Apache running and being able to connect to a Firebird server. Let's have a look at the Apache directory. Apache directory is more or less exactly a Apache directory which can be downloaded from any website where you can download an Apache server current version. And in the Apache setup, or in the zip file that you can download, you have a conf directory, and in the conf directory you find a httpd.conf file. And the http.conf file, that is important for our steps, what we are currently working on. For example, here we have defined some parameters. Most of the parameters are standard, they are not changed. But we have here, for example, the server root, SRV root directory. And that's, for example, one of the reasons why we have here the recommendation, please unpack everything to drive C and the subfolder IBEweb, and you will see what is technically done. And this one is here now defined inside the Firebird application, inside the Apache, for being here as a kind of a macro. Then we have here the listen port. If you want to use the same application on a public available web server, which is technically no problem, you can do that. You should change here the listen address, because at the moment we are only listening to localhost and port 8080, and the standard port is not 8080, it's 80. And it would be also no big problem to have here a public available IP address when you're working on a root server, on a provider that you want to work with. We have some more settings. Most of the settings are completely exactly as default. But here we have again the server name, localhost 8080, and we have some more settings where the htdocs directory, for example, is. It's in server root htdocs. And we have at the end some more things, and some more things is simply when I have a look at PHP, we see here, for example, the part that is important for PHP access. PHP is simply the library that is used by the Apache server to connect to a Firebird server. And PHP is a well-known technology in the market, and it's really easy, and it has some pre-built connector to Firebird. You do not have to install any third-party tool or something like that. PHP can directly connect to a Firebird server, and you will see later a little bit how easy it can be done based on the technology that I will show you. And the second information here is where is the PHP information defined, and this one here connects any file that is called PHP, that's what the extension PHP, that is always directly connected to this handler, to this DLL. What is interesting is always you should know when you are working with a Windows environment and you are working with a PHP Apache DLL, you need a Firebird client library, fbclient.dll, and that Firebird client library should be placed somewhere where it is accessible by the Apache process. For example, this means in that case that we have it typically in the Apache bin directory or in the PHP directory. That depends wherever you want that. But you have it already pre-installed in that current installation, so you do not need to take care about that. But if you, for example, try to install that on your own machine, have that in mind. You need somewhere a PHP compatible FB client DLL somewhere in the search path. So let's have a look at what we have on top. We have on top the connection here, that here is a PHP directory. PHP directory, same situation, almost a exact copy of the zip file that you can download. And we have here a PHP ini file. And the PHP ini file is extremely complex. And we need in the PHP ini file, search for Firebird. And here we have the extension directly connected to C, IBE Web, Apache, Inc, PDO, Firebird, DLL. ext is a standard directory in the PHP subdirectory, and you will typically find here a PHP PDO Firebird, PDO data objects, whatever the P is. I think something like PHP data objects or something like that. You can directly use that. And in this directory, you will have now the connection that PHP is capable to connect to Firebird. That's really important. And more or less the other parts that are here in the config file are remaining as they are before. Let's go back to the PHP ext directory. In that ext directory, we have in the pre-configuration the FB client DLL, because in that directory where this DLL is loaded, you also can find the PHP directory. And here is the PHP PDO Firebird DLL, which is part of the PHP project, so nothing externally is needed for that part at least. And you can also connect to other databases. And people who were already able to work with Apache and PHP will not find any rocket science behind that. That's really a little bit the boring part of today's presentation. But you will definitely see if it's not working, you will definitely have to check all these points. Otherwise, you will not find a real reason for that. And if it does not answer on the port that you expect, it's really annoying, and that would make your job a little bit harder. Let's have a look back at the batch file, what we are doing here. At the batch file, what we are doing here is really simple. We do some copy from IBE Web Demo 1 HTML. The files are copied to IBE Web Apache 2.4 docs Demo 1. Let's have a look. Docs, HD docs, Demo 1. And let's have a look at what is here included. What we see here is a very simple example. You see here directly the index.html file that I already showed you in the source code in the browser. And you will also see here the JavaScript file. JavaScript file is here connected. You see here, script type text, source Java project 1.js. You will later see that the basic project that I show you here is simply created using Lazarus and TMSWebCore, and that makes a lot of things much easier than you will have in mind if you would have done that in your own environment. Let's have a look at the JavaScript file. And as you can imagine, the JavaScript file is definitely not the best option if you have perhaps some basic Pascal knowledge to write it on your own. The JavaScript file that is created by that application is extremely complex, but it's really helpful, and you will definitely have a look. You can have a look later at how the example works, and it's much easier, like you have imagined that currently. You should also find a data.php file, and the data.php file, that is the one that we want to currently work with. That's the easiest possibility that we have at the moment. And when we go here, for example, to the data.php, we see here some example, and later we will have the possibility what the example is in fact physically doing. The data.php is technically that script. And that script simply says the following. We have here a basic connection. Every PHP script is introduced by PHP preview prior code. Error reporting is set off, and we say try, and we get a database handle from the function new PDO, and we have here the connection string to our local database, to the DB1 database, and we say begin transaction. We get the data from that SQL statement, and the SQL statement here until here is simply a string connected. So we have here select txt from IBEweb with the first parameter, and we say simply here that's the result. And everything that is now executed in that line is now sent back to the browser. That's a basic architecture to see, for example, a very basic PHP script implementation instead of having a look for your first testing in the 1,000 lines of code examples, but which you will never understand at the first moment, and I also do not understand. I'm a very lazy guy regarding the PHP understanding. I can do most of the things I really need to do, but that's also almost all that we need. But what is done here when we are connecting to the database, connecting to a SQL script to the database and get the results back here? It's really easy. We go to that database, which is shown here, and we have here, for example, a table. And let's have a look at this table. This table, for example, the categories table is a simple example. And we just want to have a very basic example how to access data from a web front end, for example, from this application, from our Firebird database. And what we are doing here is really simple. We can, for example, do that statement. And that statement is, I think, for whatever reason, it does not answer. Let's go back to select txt from category. That's the result that I want to have. What does that mean? I simply send a command to my database, and my connector inside the database is here the data.php script, and that one, this part is responsible for giving the parameter that I sent here called CMD to this procedure. So for example, select txt from category. These are the spaces here in HTML URL encoding, and we get these informations here back. What's happening technically? When we send that to the database server, the database server will have a look at this procedure, the so-called IBEweb procedure. And the IBEweb procedure is a very basic implementation for you to understand how you can, for example, initiate SQL statements from a web client and get the results back to the web client when the data is processed inside a Firebird database. Let's have a look at what technically happens. I will show you here the DAT operator. The DAT operator is really simple. A operator that can be understood if you, for example, simply do some calls on the procedure. And how such a call is technically done, we will do some very small changes here inside our database. We will do, for example, inside our database, we will create a new simple log procedure, a log table. Create a table IBE log ID big int not null primary key, and perhaps some text, whatever it is. We just need to have some possibilities to store some operations inside that inside that operation. And I will simply say here update or insert into IBE log ID txt values 1 and the DAT parameter that will come into my procedure. That should be only, that's the typical way how we develop procedures. The procedure is more or less the application server behind the database engine or behind the SQL calls. And when you see, for example, now what happens here technically inside, and it works already, like we have seen here, I will restart that, and I will have here the operation error. What is the error here? Select txt from category. It shows me a error. It could be a very easy error. Let's go to the grant manager, and our new table could be because we are not having enough rights for that. Let's go to the rights, and we compile that. This one is, and let's go back here and try that again. It did not work for whatever reason. Let's have a look why this happened. That's definitely part of that line. I will simply do a let's do it a little bit different. Delete from IBE log and restart that again. I still have the problem IO. Sometimes a guy is sitting in front of your presentation is simply too stupid. I have currently logged this database here from a different Firebird instance. That's a problem. That's the only problem. Sometimes you just have to read that because create file open operation for that database is currently not possible. When I do that now again, I see here the original data. The basic reason for that is my current Firebird server that I'm currently using is a standard port 3050. I do not have used a specific port here. And the Firebird server that we are distributing to you is a one on 3051. That's a very simple reason. So anytime when I have opened that database, I cannot connect to that database from the Apache server. That's a really easy way. But let's have a look at the IBE log table, what was technically now stored inside that table. The txt is exactly the SQL statement that we have sent. So when we go back now here to that procedure, we have now here the very easy implementation, what's technically done. And I will do now a simple trick that we are really often using for debugging stored procedures and so on. When I say here, for example, if that is null, so I get no parameter at all, then that equals exactly that statement. So one of the basic technologies that we are often using inside IBExpert, now I have a procedure that has some input parameters, but if no input parameter is given, I have a default input parameter that allows me really to do the debugging process, which can be started by the pressing of F8 button or on this tool button here. Can be done much easier. I also can do a double click here on that procedure parameter and enter that data here manually. But the easier way is simply to have a kind of a default parameter set when the input parameter is null, because in that case you really have a very easy way to do the debugging. So we are now in line number 1. We are going now to F8. F8 button is now executing the next operation. F8, 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 and so on. And you see here, for example, now we have here a small functionality, which is a procedure that will give us a cleaning of some SQL statements. Some of the characters that can be sent needs to be replaced. We can have a look at that a little bit later. And if the SQL statement starts with a select, we can do the following. We are creating a SQL select. So we are now pressing on F8. And we have now here the original statement, because SQL select is still the possible implementation. And we are now doing an execute statement from inside that procedure and give every record back to the txt parameter. And we have now a result set. So let's try to click again on F8, F8. And you see here on below action, animation, children, classics, comedy, and everything else. So the basic idea is simply to send this procedure a SQL statement, and the procedure should do the SQL statement using such a technical implementation, which is for a select statement extremely easy. But for other statement, it could be a little bit more complex. But you will see here in a later example, when we go back to the IBE category table, we can, for example, have a look here at item number 19. And item number 19, let's go disconnected from that database. And we simply here write a new statement, update category set txt equals abc, where id equals 19. So when we execute such a statement, we do not get any information back. But when we have now a look back to the database, we should now see the result. But I think I have to, let's do it a little bit different. I think it could be because of the I hope I did not change too much last week when I was doing that same session with the German speaking audience. But now you see that I have here now the original data available. I was now doing the update category set txt equals null where id equals 19. This was exactly in the same way sent back from the SQL statement to the PHP. The PHP took that string and sent it back to the application here. And in the application, in the database, in the IBE web procedure, we simply executed that. And for that reason, you can, for example, also understand why it's not a good idea to have such an unrestricted access to SQL statements inside your database. But it's just for demo reasons, and typical implementation, how to make it a little bit more secure is really to send some additional parameters. Otherwise, the IBE web procedure will not even work on that topic. But if we have, for example, here the update statement implemented, we will definitely here directly see what the problem is. And that since our statement does not start with a select statement, we have now here the second part of the application. And the second part of the application, it does not start with an execute block, and it does not have a suspend. So it also should not do that. So we are now in the third statement, and in the third statement, we are directly at the update statement, which is sent without any restriction to the database. So from a very easy way, I could also do here a drop table customer or something like that. That would not work because the customer table has some restrictions because of it. It has references to other databases. It would be ignored in that case. But it could be an option. And in most cases, just to have an idea behind how technically it can be done, if you are working with such a kind of a data.php accessing PHP script that connects between the Apache PHP engine and the Firebird server, you are not restricted to only one parameter. You can also send some more parameters, and the parameter can, for example, be a username and password. And when you're working with a username and a password, and you get, for example, from the server back a select, which is a kind of a session ID, and in each of the following statements, you need to send a valid session ID from the last 60 minutes or whatever. In that case, you can make a very easy restriction for accessing the data against people who do something that is called a so-called SQL injection. And SQL injection is, when you search for that, it's a very good way to hack a bad application. So always have that in mind, that people, when you send parameters to the server, that parameters can be misused to be SQL statements, and a lot of MySQL-based applications allow very stupid SQL injections, and that's very often you have to think about that. But for example, to have a look back at some simple examples, we will go back now to the scripts that we are working on, because what I showed you just in that moment was a very simple implementation, and a very simple implementation. Let's have a look here at the Apache directory, demo1 data. I think I have done the database file I should have already downloaded from last time. Otherwise, I will download that for you a little bit later. But it's also a very easy way to change that. I have here a specific database, but database which is called here barcode3.ftb, and I will take some extremely simple example for you to understand what we have here inside the that could be a small problem if I show it to you. We will start with a different version of the demo. I will have to prepare a little bit more on that, a little bit easier later. Let's go back to the running processes. Currently we have the running process, my Firebird and my HTTP. I will stop these processes and I will start again the first batch file, which will restart that. And what we see here is now the same problem again. If I have the database connected from a different Firebird instance, it does not make sense. If I change that and I switch to the 3051 port, it should no longer be a problem because now we are using both the same operation. And if I go here, we have exactly the same call back on the database. Let's have a look at how to have the possibilities to understand what happens when I press on this button. One of the ways is really easy. That's a trace API. In IBExpert, you can always activate trace API. Trace API simply means we are now tracing on the server side what happens inside the database from a physical point of view, what is executed inside the Firebird database server. We are connecting to that server. We are connecting using this DBA master key, and we set this as default. I extended that length here because the SQL string is often much longer than the default 300 bytes. And when I say here, it is now connected. And when I press on that button, technically it does exactly what we see here. So I stop the tracing, I stop the session. And let's have a look at what we have visible here. We get here some information that are technical operations which are done because the PHP or the Apache server connects to a Firebird server. That's always important. Any PHP access to the database server will typically initiate a new connection when we have a look here at the database monitoring. And we will not see a SQL statement currently active from any Apache web server because the Apache web server only connects using, at least in default setting, only connects from a process, from the Apache server process to the database and disconnects immediately. But we still have the possibilities, for example, to understand what happens technically inside. So we attach to the database, as you can see here. We start a transaction. We get a SQL statement, which is exactly this SQL statement. That is sent, as you might have expected that already, that is sent directly to the database server. And the database server is now simply responding and sending the data back to the client. The database server itself is responsible for that. And when we have seen that a little bit later here, for example, select current timestamp from RDB$database and so on, that is the second statement that I initiated on the other application. So you can see really it's not a big overhead. That's really more or less the application itself creates some basic SQL statement, and the SQL statement is sent to the server. And on the server side, you can directly have a look at the results. When we see directly exactly the same SQL statement here, I had the wrong part in my clipboard. Let's go back to trace and audit, activate that, and that's default. And let's go back to that script here, for example, the data.php, select txt from category. We see here the results, and we see here on the server side exactly what comes back. So that was a statement that was initiated by the database server itself. And the interesting thing is now when I execute exactly the same statement here again, I will see a similar result set. Similar result set when I want to have that to be improved a little bit, IBE web or something like that. And I want to have that execute statement SQL into txt, because that is a select statement and so on, and we will do that here. We can do, for example, here for a list of results, we can, for example, do the following. We can here add a constant character return line feed, a constant break behind that data. But that does not make sense. At this position, into txt, do txt equals txt, and put the break behind that. And the do again, suspend, and let's use here a semicolon, and now we should have the result. And when we now see the result for the same result set, so we simply say, okay, we give no parameter inside, we see exactly the same result set. We have no longer a result set. Let's look here, and txt equals should already have the, let's have a look at what I did wrong here. Txt equals I think I placed it in the wrong line, but should also be no problem, because that part should be here and not there, because that part is the execute block only part. So let's give back that to the original start. So let's start again the result set. And when we go back now to the SQL statement, we now see that we have the character return line feed in each line. And as you can see here in the result set, when I execute the same result set again, it will give us a new result set, at least it should be. Let's have a look what happens here. Select txt from category. So now we see multi-line results. So multi-line results, when you have a look on the right side here to the page source, the page source is currently only writing this character return line feed, the break in HTML language, directly inside your result set. And it makes it easy to you, for example, entering some data or doing some informations into your application, into your frontline application here. and to have a look, for example, at formatted output or so. We will have a look later at some input operations, but that's already one of the parts that you should have in mind. We often use really stored procedures to format already stuff that is typically done inside a front end. For example, a table format and some basic HTML stuff. And it's not so unuseful to have that functionality, for example, here inside my my basic stored procedure code already. Let's have a look at the basic ideas of the different application, the barcode application. When I go to the barcode application, I think it should be already available here. And let's have a look at barcode application that has the different calling parameters, but I will place the barcode applications needed operations on the server to show you what I am talking about. That can take a few seconds. Sorry for that. And but that's also no big deal. That's this one. I have to look it up on the second server. We will see that in a few seconds. And let's place the in the htdocs directory. No, I will not override it. I will do a new folder, BC, and I will show you some very basic functionality based on that. So let's have a look here at this current connection. So the current connection should be the connection to this database, which is this database here, and we should be possible to have that. Why is this one not available? 3051. Because it could be that I have dropped that. No, it's still here. CDB DB1. Does it still running? The Firebird is definitely running. The one is also running. This one is that's really interesting. Why does it not work at that time? Anyone have a clue? Barcode 3.ftp. I don't during login. Makes no sense from my perspective. On this database, we have the data. Let's have a look if we can connect that. It's not a good preparation. I will have to prepare some of the examples a little bit more in detail after a short break, perhaps. But what I want to show you here is really simple. What we have here is a even similar application. And we have here more or less a specific server with a specific username password combination. And we have here some more complex access to other parameters that we are using here. Here, for example, we have an additional parameter for the server remote address. There we get the IP address from the server directly into our stored procedure. And the interesting thing is, when you do that, you can have a look at this database. I have to look up why that is not currently available on the other machine. And you have here not only one parameter, you have three parameters, CMD, dot, and the IP parameter. And you will see in an example, which I will perhaps prepare after a short break, that we can have here a different way of answering to specific operations, because that's really interesting also to understand. If CMD equals booking, so this parameter is given by the appropriate button that comes from the front end. And we decide here inside this individual button, which is the parameter that is set. And then we use different parameters, different stored procedures. For example, the booking procedure here, for example, is really simple. It creates a header, and the header is then the original data that was sent to the procedure itself, and the dot parameter is replaced by some specific, for example, this one here is the so-called session ID in our technology. And then we will do the individual operation here technically. So that example database is also available inside the zip file that you have, that you can download. And if you download that zip file tomorrow, you will have a different data.php file for the accessing this individual barcode database. So, but that's not the only one that we have in mind. Let's have a look back at the original applications that you have seen when we were starting the batch file. Let's go back to the main directory, IBE web main directory, and let's go back to the application. And we have now here the what is that now? I think we have to do some processing. Firebird, to be sure that every batch file runs perfectly fine, simply end the processes of all these scripts by hand before you start that. And it should be now. Hello? What is today again with my machine? These are the moments when you try to do a presentation that you have done already 10 days ago for the German people without any technical problem. And today it does not like me any longer. Let's go back and start that again. It does not like me any longer for whatever reasons. That's definitely a bad moment today. Let's go back to that Firebird, that Firebird, that Firebird, and that Firebird. And let's go back to the htdocs, or make it in the easy way. I unpack the full folder from the zip file again. So you will see the original content of the zip file again, because it could be that I overwrote something a few minutes ago, and that's definitely not a good moment to do so. I hope that now demo 1 will be again running. And as you see, it will run here again. That is an extremely simple example. We can also have a demo 2 example and a demo 3 example. I think it should be, demo 3 should definitely be there. And in demo 3, for example, you see a little bit more, also a nicer example, but you also see a possibility here to edit some data. I will not talk about any detail of that project, because part of that is part of the training document. But what I want to let you know is really a very helpful part, perhaps, for the future. If you want to get in touch with what I show you next, is the basic technology that we are using in the next example is based on this magazine's special edition. Lazarus is a kind of an open source Delphi. If you have never used Lazarus, I can recommend to do so. We are doing every of our new projects since, I think, more than 7 years or so already, only based on Lazarus and no longer based on Delphi. The knowledge that you have in the Delphi market is more or less exactly one-to-one reusable in the Lazarus market. And the Blaze Pascal magazine is a magazine where you can subscribe for a paper version or a PDF version of that magazine. It's a monthly magazine with a lot of possible examples, a lot of possible code, also for Delphi, but also for Lazarus. And the interesting thing is, when you download that project here, go to download that one here, make more or less exactly what they are talking here. Download that zip file, download request a trial license, and that is extremely important. To enter that trial license, you have to download that part here. That part here is a zip file, and then you will have the possibility to enter the trial key. Otherwise, it could be hard to find where to enter that. And the interesting thing is they have some different technical test projects available here. But I want to show you, I want to give you a short impression what is technically implemented, what we are seeing here as an application already. I get the information, is everything okay? Yes, for sure, it's okay. And let's have a look at the project. A lot of people often remember when they are working with Lazarus some Delphi 6, Delphi 7, Delphi 5 or so environment, but they have really, even that they might look in some cases a little bit more outdated, like the current Delphi environment. It's extremely flexible and extremely powerful also. Let's go to the original project that we are currently talking about. The project is the project 1 here from this directory. And the project 1 from this directory has the following source code. We have here now a form, use CGI. We have a button, we have a label. Let's have a look at how it is technically implemented. Technically, we have here the checkbox, which is at the moment not really important. We will use that later. But this button here, for example, if you will have a look back at this application itself, and this one was the demo 1 application. This is the checkbox, this is the button, this is the label. When I click on the button, I would see on the label a timestamp. When we have a look here at the on-click event of that button, that's the most important or the more complex thing is that we do not want to get the timestamp from the local system, but from the Firebird server. Let's have a look how this button click event is implemented. And we have a look at the button click event, how it is implemented. It's always important to know that we have here the almost exact same structure that you know from a classical Delphi or Lazarus application, but we only use some special components for that. So if we, for example, have a look at double click on this event, we will see here what was technically implemented. We have implemented a very basic source code example for our training material, but also for you to understand it a little bit easier. And here we, for example, say CGI equals web checkbox 1.checked. Do we want to use the PHP connection, or do we want to have the CGI connection? XX SQL, and we send exactly this SQL statement to the server, and the response text is given back from execute SQL, as we see here, for example, in this class. XX SQL is simply meaning here, for example, we do some formatting on the SQL statement. If it starts with a SQL statement, then get field names just to get a local possibility to show some data. If CGI, then use this URL for the data. If it's not using CGI PHP, then use this URL for the data. And hdr.send, and the response text here is a function that is currently going to that class that is created here on the fly. So it's a really, when you have a look at this full example, together with these approximately 40 lines of code that are just doing some replacements, the full project is approximately 160 lines. So it's approximately a little bit more than 100 lines that you need to understand for an application which is created based on the TMSWebCore stuff, and which can be used, for example, in the following way. Let's do some classical programming. We have some components and TMS. I think most of you might already know TMS components, TMSWebCore. It's really a very powerful extension for the Lazarus, but also for the Delphi market solutions. TMSWebCore. It's a company from Belgium, and they have really fantastic projects and products. And one of the projects are the TMSWebCore product. And it's really interesting if you want to have some basic functionality inside your development process, but you rely on basic knowledge of your perhaps Delphi programming knowledge. You do not have to reinvent yourself. Let's have a look at possibilities here. For example, here we have a web label, we have a web button, we have a web edit, we have a spin edit, we have components for whatever you can imagine. And each of these components can be directly used on such a web form project. Technically, what happens technically is really simple. If I click, for example, on the web edit, I click it here into that form, and I save that, and I compile that, and I run that. it will typically start with the TMSWebCore internal web server. That's one of the parts that is distributed together with TMSWebCore. And it will show me the application without the possibilities to have a PHP or a connection to CGI a little bit later. But you can, for example, do a lot of other operations already really smart in that way. We will have a look at that a little bit later. But the interesting part is that you do not have any direct contact from the web application to the Firebird server, because that one is still used using a different technology. For whatever reason, my current application does not like me anymore. I think my computer does not have a good day today. Let's have a look at what happened after I compiled that. I'm in demo 1. I'm in HTML. And these files were completely newly compiled, as you can see here. I copy these files. I place these files manually into my demo 1 source code directory. I replace all files, and I will have a look at the form 1, and I press F5, and for whatever reason it does not show me the button. I do not know what is the current problem. Sometimes you have days when your when your solution does not look so good as you would have expected. This one is exactly the one that we expected. Task manager. Let's go. I think it could be some reason behind that. Let's have a look at what happens here and what happens if I double click that in the original directory. So the project 1 directory where it was compiled. We have here the HTML output directory, and when we open that one with Brave, it seems to have some problems that I cannot solve at the moment. I think it's today not my best day. But this happens. Last week, when I was showing that in the German video, it was much smoother than what I was able to show. But we will have a look at these basic ideas a little bit later. I can still explain what should happen, and what should happen is really simple. Even that you see only approximately 160 lines of code here, and from that we have already a lot of lines with useless code. What happens when you compile the application? Run, compile. It is not creating an executable file, it is creating a JavaScript file. So we can also show that. Let's have a look. So that was compiled, and I think run without debugging is, I think, the thing that I should work. But it seems I have done some improvement in my virtual machine that are not so good from last week. What's technically done is the Pascal source code is compiled completely to a JavaScript source code. And inside the JavaScript source code, you now have the original functionality at the end. You see more or less a they call it not a compiler, it's called a transpiler, because it transfers the original Pascal language to a JavaScript compatible language. And you do not have to think about that, but you always have to have in mind that almost anything inside your code is more or less readable outside the application. So if you have, for example, some connection to a specific database library or so, and you are using a username and password inside your application code here, it could also be no good idea to have that compiled into JavaScript, because in the next step, the JavaScript application can be simply opened inside the web browser and everybody can understand what's technically happening inside. I will do the operation here technically, and I will show you what happens when you have compiled that and you have created, for whatever reason, I have some technical problem to do so at the moment, but when you have compiled that and opened that application, we always have also a so-called js.map file, which is a mapping file between the two languages. And when we go to the web browser and try to understand what our application will do, there's, for example, in Brave, it's called inspect. A lot of other applications will have a functionality, Chrome, for example, or Firefox, that allow you to go to the sources. And allow you to go to the sources is really simple. You see here the original source code in Pascal source code. And when we now click here on a specific name also, so we do the web button click, we can set here a breakpoint. And the breakpoint, for example, if I click here, is now simply extremely easy to manage. And we can now step here through the code and see, for example, what happens in the next situation and the next situation and so on. So the basic development of an application connected to a Firebird server is shown here in one of these projects. And when we are going to a little bit more complex project, let's have a look at the open project number 3. That one is the one that I showed you already technically. We have here some more complex data. For example, we have here an insert, an edit, a cancel button, a delete button, a save button. And when we go to insert button, you see here, for example, action equals a insert and set controls a insert and so on. And what happens technically is simple. 1, 2, 7. Let's go back to the batch file again. We get the data and we say, for example, for the number 19, I just clicked on the number 19. I say, for example, here, test 1. I think when I now press on save, I see now the data here. And that's, for example, here, that is a web table control, one of the components available for the development. And the save button, for example, simply does a my data create, execute procedure, sends the data to the server, and category update or something like that. So it's also a very basic example, and the knowledge of code that you really need to understand your application. And this application will also run on any mobile device, which is really important here. For example, if you want to add new data, test 1 or something like that, test 2. When you want to add new data, it's really easy to do so, even without knowing the basic functionality that is behind the stuff that you have to understand for the individual platforms. When we go to TMSWebCore, and you will have a look at some of the demos. You have, for example, extremely complex demos, but also all the demos like the Google Calendar connection is also technically possible to reload from that. But that is not for display data. When we have a look at the calendar control, the calendar control is itself here the planner. So you have here the FNC planner for demo, and you also have the full version of TMSWebCore. It's not everything inside the free version, but in the full version of WebCore, for example, here you have the possibility to display or read QR codes, two-dimensional barcodes, one-dimensional barcodes, 3D operations, jQuery mobile. For jQuery mobile, you have specific controls which make the accessibility of your application on mobile devices a little bit more easy for people working with their thumb only. And TMS REST connection, so a very easy component to connect to any REST server somewhere. Web data access, web data controls, it's a different way of connecting from your TMSWebCore application directly to a different database server, but in that case you need to have something on the other side. And what I wanted to show you together in the first example was already a little bit easier. Different components, for example, to access to the web camera, to read, for example, barcodes or something like that from your mobile device. So you can, for example, use your Android device, or you can use your iOS device and press a button in your web application, and using this component, it will show you the possibility to read, for example, a barcode or something like that. And when you press a specific button for that, it can process the reading at the moment, and you have events in that. It's an extremely complex framework with solutions for almost anything, but you are not forced to have a basic binary compilation for each platform. One of the biggest disadvantages from my point of view at the FireMonkey implementation, which is the current implementation for Delphi for mobile applications, is that you still have the requirement that everything that you compile must be in a proper compiler set up for this individual platform. When you have a look at that, what is done here inside your application that is compiled by Pass2JS. Pass2JS is a compiler that is part of the Lazarus project. Bruno with TMS software is using exactly this compiler also for his Delphi project. So if you buy, for example, TMSWebCore and you want to use it for Delphi, it's exactly the same price. You have only a product price, and if you want to use it for Delphi, or if you want to use it for Lazarus, you just have to pay it once per developer. So you do not have to pay it twice. And the Pass2JS compiler is a really powerful compiler environment. And one of the really interesting things is when you, for example, want to get in touch with some of the core developers. One of the core developers of the Path2JS compiler is Michael van Canate. It's a Belgian guy. It's a really smart guy, and he was also really on a lot of conferences where we attended on. And he's never doing a talk because he says, I'm not a speaker in a conference, I'm a visitor of a conference, and I want to sit there in the background and want to listen what the people say. The funny thing was we had already several conferences when we were talking about the Lazarus configurations, the Lazarus environments, and so on. And Michael was always often sitting in the last row of the audience. And when I was talking whatever kind of bullshit in that moment, perhaps not really bullshit, but perhaps something wrong or something I did not have in mind at that moment, there was often a remark from Michael from the background that he was giving me informations about that I'm just currently talking on was a little bit wrong, but there's a better solution for that. Let's show it in the following way. It's really interesting to have the access to basic core developers if you need them. So if you decide, for example, to work on a product that you want to have in the future also available, and not people who are, for example, working with the Android support and Delphi know that 64-bit and some other stuff where you're not allowed, or it's impossible for you to upload new application versions from that. You can do whatever you want with a company like Embarcadero. They will not give you the possibility to do so until they have the next release of their application. And I think today I read that 10.4 is now on the horizon or something like that. A lot of existing bugs are replaced by new bugs, as always, but I do not want to bash them, but I know it's sometimes important to have access to the core developers in at least in company projects. And it's really interesting when you can, for example, order a hotline session with Michael. You can do that. You just contact IBExpert for that. You can do that. If something is, for example, in the Path2JS compiler, not in the way implemented as you need that, it's no technical problem to get in touch with Michael. And Matthias Gärtner, for example, is one of the guys behind the Lazarus IDE project. And if you want to, for example, have some additional functionality inside the Lazarus IDE project, just contact us. There's a company in Netherlands. They are called the Lazarus Factory, and we are working with them together. And the Lazarus Factory is, for example, a producer of services in the Lazarus Path2JS ecospace. And anytime you need, for example, a functionality to be backwards compatible, or a new functionality, for example, some people were asking about the possibility to have QR barcodes to be scanned inside WebCore applications. It's definitely easy to find a solution for that. That's really one of the things that open source will make possible, and closed source, like in the good old market, in not all products are really helpful for that. So one of the things you also should have in mind when you try to work with such a project based on the script and based on the training document, if you start with that, you will definitely have the possibility to be sure that in the future you are not forced to change from that current project environment to a different one, because I still believe that it is one of the technologies for the future. Why do I believe so? One of the test projects that we always did is, for example, a IBExpert.com, and I think it's time. What is called? I have to look up the project name. Just to give you a basic, would already be enough time. So it's a demo application, and you find also the explanation how it technically completely works inside inside the Lazarus-based Pascal magazine. There is a demo description and an article about that. And the basic idea is the following. if we press here on start, we will store some local data. It will start some local accounting and so on. And if we press on the stop button, it will store a local record. That sounds a little bit boring, but it's not really boring because what's technically happening here when you go to inspect and you say, I think we have to do, there's a possibility to go offline network. And I think we go offline. And the funny thing is, when I click here on start, it still works. It cannot connect, for example, here, for example, the favorite icon from the web server because the web server is currently not connected, but the application itself completely works. So technically, we know from several projects that a web application environment that is only server-based is a nice idea, but not in all areas possible. We have, for example, in the restaurant market, we have a very big customer, and they have, for example, technical problems to do bookings on their inventory when they need new products and so on. They have a big refrigerator room, and inside the refrigerator room, which is often in the cellar of the building, you do not have any web access because you should not have the door to be opened, and it should stay cool inside. And when you want to enter some data into a mobile device, it's always a bad idea to always go out of the door to enter your data there and go back inside and count there. One of the things that is technically possible within Pass2JS or a TMSWebCore application is really simple. It can run without any online connection. And that's one of the things, for example, that other projects that you might have in mind, UniGUI, for example. UniGUI is a toolkit that can be used for web application development, but it always needs a server connection. Anytime when you are in the front end and you want to connect to that server application, and you do not have any server application responding, or a bad, for example, a bad connection, or as we were, I think Christian remembers when we were talking to that guy in USA about the, they have an application which is running for police officers, and police officers often drive around with their cars, and sometimes they have to use it in offline environments because when you are in, somewhere at the end of Nevada or Texas or wherever, you do not always have an internet connection. Also not in USA. There are areas where you do not have an internet connection. But if you, for example, need a possibility to work still on your application, like we have here in our time tracking part, we can, for example, store the data, and we store the records here. And when you read, for example, in the source code, I think it could be also when we have here the source code, I think I removed the, Pascal source code, the map file. Otherwise, we would have seen here also the original source code. And that's one of the things that we, for example, also can use inside such an application. If we are offline or not, we can, for example, download local data. We can have them on the mobile device even without any local connection in a tunnel or wherever you have no local connection to any Wi-Fi environment on a mountain or so. There are still some areas where technical requirements are where you do not have any local connection. You can still write a mobile application which is running inside your web browser, so you can have your dedicated Android device, and your Android device can be used, for example, for scanning barcodes or whatever. And as soon as you are reconnecting to any Wi-Fi network, you can then upload the data, download the data, update anything in the network connection again. And that's technically possible because the basic idea of what Pass2GS and the Lazarus Pass2GS implementation, also that the Delphi implementation does do, is simply create some files, and these files here in the HTML folder, only these files needs to be accessible one time from the server to run the application, and it's really easy to have them downloaded on your mobile device and have the possibility to start the same application on your mobile device. I could show you here on the time tracking the same application. If you open that by your mobile phone, you can, for example, click on the bookmark button, and you can place a bookmark of the time tracking application on your mobile device, and it will use a specific set of files. There's, for example, I think a manifest file or something like that, which is here sometimes connected. I do not know where it is at the moment exactly. It could be because I'm offline at the moment, but the manifest file, for example, technically does is responsible, for example, to download the additional JavaScript files, but also the JavaScript file for the time tracking itself. And then it is possible to use the same application on your mobile device without any local without any Wi-Fi connection required in that moment. And I think that's a really interesting technology. A lot of fat client applications do not have that problem because they are never offline, but on mobile devices, it's always a very bad idea. For example, if you have some time tracking applications for your customer, and you always need to first have a connect to any remote server that will allow you to connect to that system. So UniGUI is a very interesting technology, but from my perspective, not really future-proof, because that one is a application that is compiled on a server and must run on a server. And anytime you get disconnected, you are already you are also disconnected from that application. Intraweb, for example, a lot of you might perhaps already use Intraweb. And Intraweb, A to Z, Intraweb has the same technical problem. Intraweb is, for example, in a lot of environments with the same problem again. You also have to have a compiled executable, and the compiled executable will send you the results. If you do not have access to the compiled executable, which must run somewhere, it's impossible to work with that application. Yeah, that's more or less a kind of an overview. I think I will perhaps add some later examples for the other database that I have planned to show you, the so-called barcode database, because in that database, it's the most simple way to show data from a web server, from a Firebird server into a web application. But I think it could be also a very easy way to check out the examples, to check out the Lazarus version that is available for download, as I showed you on the URL already. The URL is also written inside a text file, and every of these files, IBExpert.com, get together. So you see here the text file, and here in the text file you also see the URL, and also the information for the zip file where you have to download that you do not forget that. Do not try that in other directories. In that case, it will definitely not work. and it's 29 gigabytes. You will also find today's video here in a few hours. It will be available also on our IBExpert YouTube channel, because in IBExpert YouTube channel you always have the possibility also to use them on your mobile device with other resolutions and so, but the upload on IBExpert YouTube channel typically takes a little bit more than 2 or 3 hours. But tomorrow you will also find that video there, but you will also find the videos of the last week, for example, there. That's also always one of our platforms where we want to distribute that. It's also possible to see some really older versions of videos there, but the newest versions that we did here for the get together and the Stammtisch, it's really, I think it's interesting to watch them, because a lot of people were already asking to ask some detailed questions about that, and we were really sometimes astonished about the quality of questions. That's really one of the things I really like, and I really like to make such a presentation. Today there was some bugs in my presentation, but I think for next week we will definitely have some more topics, and we can talk about some issues that are still open. I think next week the topic we have already announced, because we typically do the German session 10 days later, always in English, and I will try to prepare some of the basics there also. One of the things that we just announced, when you, for example, working with IBExpert, you will definitely see that from today we have a new IBExpert version available, and for software manufacturers we have a new service available. We have the so-called IFS server available in European but also worldwide already. IFS server, IBExpert, and we have a let's go back to here, IBExpert.net, and the technical stuff like the IFS server is a dedicated server which is really optimized for Firebird access. And we know from so many customers that they are really complaining about the speed of applications. And we had, for example, last week we had a customer who wanted also to test that server, and we have now the possibility to test that server over a remote access. Technically, the servers are typically distributed using the Windows operating system or Linux operating system. If we can decide for you which one is a better operating system, it's always Linux from our perspective, definitely. Because a Windows environment for a database server, which will reboot whenever it wants and will upload new driver whenever it wants, I think it's no good idea to have that as a reliable system inside your application. And the biggest problem that we have with Windows there is always that Windows sometimes, for example, does changes with the booting mode of such a server. And we experienced in the past, for example, that after an update that was done by Windows Update for whatever reason, after the next reboot failed, and in that moment you might be in big trouble with your application. So what we are doing here is now really simple. Also with the Linux version, we can offer you access to a real live server that is exactly the server that we are offering here for approximately €2,500. And you can install, for example, your own software on that server inside a virtual machine and test the Firebird functionality and the Firebird speed of your application directly on such a machine. We have, for example, the customer that we are 2 weeks ago talking to. They are using a very complex ERP system, the ABEP ERP system, approximately a database, one of the biggest Firebird databases that exists on the market. More than 2,500 tables, 8,000 procedures, 10,000 triggers, and so on, approximately 20,000 indices. And this customer is working with approximately 300 employees on that database. And he was complaining about the speed of the hardware, and we delivered the high-end server version of this server to them. And every of the people were already really happy about that they changed the server from a really expensive but not really fast environment to a much less expensive but fast Firebird hardware. And we are, for example, now also offering that service not only in Germany, we also offer that all over Europe and also still to the UK, even that you were going away, but that's your problem. But also to the USA and to other countries. We delivered also one of the servers already to Australia, which is sometimes also a very interesting market, but very far away. And we can also help you, for example, to check out the speed of your application together with such an environment. Because in a lot of cases, when you're a software manufacturer, your customer will talk to you and complain to you about the speed of your application. Even he might be responsible for choosing a virtual machine and very bad hardware for Firebird, RAID 5, RAID whatever. And in that case, when they complain about the speed of your software, they typically do not believe that their machine might be part of the reason for the problems. And when you can, for example, get in contact with us and together with the customer to show your software on a powerful server and together with their original database and your application, it could be a very easy way to convince him that his server is definitely not the best choice to be used for that kind of application. And one of the first videos that I did, also for the people who might not already seen that, for every customer who's complaining about the speed of your application or when it's your internal software, have a look at the benchmark tool. The benchmark tool, just try to start the benchmark tool and try to find out what numbers we have when we deliver a server to customers. This machine for the 2,500 euro, it's less than 3,000 US dollar at the moment, is approximately will get a benchmark value of approximately 400%. We've seen 25,000 euro machines which result in benchmark values of approximately 20%. So they are more than 10 or 20 times slower than a 2,500 euro machine. With Firebird, they could do other jobs really fast, but in that case, it was really a bad idea to have that used for a Firebird machine. And when you are talking to customers and they really insist to have a virtualized environment for database servers, we understand that people might think that it's a good idea, but we have really good examples that it's not a good idea to rely on virtualized machines as a database server backup 100% guaranteed to be out of failures, because if your database file is corrupt, it does not make any difference when you put the corrupt database file from one machine to another machine, it will still not work, because it could be in that case already so much broken. And we have a big customer in Germany. They are selling clothes for motorcyclists, and really, I think almost 2,000 employees or so, and their web shop system uses a Firebird server as a backend. And they, before they decided to buy a server from us, they were also experiencing a very bad weekend because their server was completely crashed. That was not the server that we delivered. Their server was completely crashed, and they used a kind of virtualized clustering, whatever name it was, machine combination of software. And at the end, it was really simple. The mirror machine was in the same way broken like the original machine, and they really were experiencing a very bad weekend over the spring, and I think 3 years ago or so. And they were almost unable to sell any products in that time over the web shop, and that was really a bad situation. And we implemented, for example, not only the hardware for them, but also a real-time replication. So whatever they have in the future as a problem, they definitely do not have such a problem because we implement that in a very different way. And we can, for example, implement replication also in a different way. You might have known that Firebird-4 will have the possibility of a declarative replication. From my point of view, I do not really believe that it could solve what we have already solved in the last 20 years for real customers based on different Firebird versions, and we are already capable to do much more in replication than the Firebird-4 version will ever be able to do. Firebird-4 replication is more or less a kind of a hot standby backup. That's it. It's not a really multi-site replication. It's a more or less a single-site master-slave replication. When we talk about our projects to you, we are able to handle, for example, a multi-master replication with more than 200 restaurants all over Germany and some other countries around. And so if you have, for example, a requirement inside your product or your customer base, just contact us in Germany for Europe, or contact at IBExpert.com in USA. Christian is also always available for that. And we can talk about a real world project for customers who are really relying on their database, because when you talk to customers and you say, okay, your worst case scenario is now we are doing a backup and restore of your database from yesterday evening. In that case, you look already in really astonished eyes. Can't we have a better solution for that? And yes, definitely we can have better solutions for that. They are not built in Firebird, but we are able to implement that for you, and together with you, it could be part of your product that you will distribute to your customer, and you will sell them additional security based on our knowledge. I think that should be always, you should always have in mind. From the scalability or scalable perspective, I just said that one server will handle 300 users. It's 300 users with a well-written application. It's no problem at all. My perspective is approximately, when we are starting on the level of approximately 1,000 euro user per server, we should think about multiple servers when they are really doing high load, when they are just sitting in front of their office and waiting there for results of the machine. It would be no big deal. You do not even have to count them on machines that we deliver to customers. But technically, based on our replication system, we would also have no problem if we have any application with 10,000 or 20,000 euros. It's technically not a problem at all. And if you, for example, use that application as a backend for a web server, it's always important that you implement that in a proper way, and you also understand what happens if you make stupid SQL statements, because stupid SQL statements are definitely the best way to make a fast server slow, and that's definitely not the way how you should do your job. Yeah, I think for today, I think I need to open my beer. I hope you already have opened your beer, or you will also open a beer. For the US people, perhaps it's a little bit too early, but who cares? You can.
How about the glass of wine, Holger? Will that do instead?
But
I've got a wine here.
a wine. That's cool.
I've got a nice German Riesling. So I'll join you.
That's really great. It's really funny to have such a small world because of that bloody coronavirus.
I know.
It's really interesting that we have still a business in our environment where we can talk to people sitting on the other side of the world, and we still have no problem to get in touch. Also from business perspectives, we're doing a lot of remote workshops still for customers. In Germany, we have since this week, since today, reopened the restaurants. So perhaps if you are hungry, you should come to Germany, but it's mostly impossible to come to Germany at the moment. But they decided to reopen the restaurant. So let's have a look at how it will change in the future. I hope that especially also the countries USA and UK will get that under control. I saw a video from the New York governor that in New York area it might be more or less on the right way, but in the rest of USA it seems to be a very bad situation. And the biggest problem is always in all countries we have too much idiots among the brave people, and the idiots will often be the reason
Drag us
for.
all down. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If there are any questions in the future also, just send the question to support@IBExpert.com, because I'm one of the guys who's reading these emails also with the first. I will always try to answer every email. If there's an email which is approximately 2 A4 pages or 2 letter pages long, it could be that I miss some of the parts and I do only answer the first sentence of your email. But I will try to answer all the questions that I get. Typically, I try to do it every day, and you should have an answer typically within 24 hours. If not, just ask again. When you need our individual support, also on detailed products here that we distributed using the videos or to you, you can always have a booking of the hotline support. Hotline support is, for example, on any topic possible. And you can, for example, decide on your own what we should talk about in that moment. So it's really a flexible way, and you will get an appointment time for the hotline support, and we can talk about whatever you want. So yeah, thank you for attending.
I can confirm that it works.
Yeah,
you do work.
Thank you, Holger.
Thank you. Bye bye. I will stop the video now, and as I have seen, you can download the video and see the video later, and the video you can press on pause button, which is sometimes an advantage compared to the live statement. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye, Holger. And even if your computer doesn't like you, we still do.
Okay.
Goodbye. Bye all.
Bye.